Good morning and welcome to a hybrid public meeting of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. I'm in a committee room in the Palace of Westminster with the small number of staff required to facilitate the meeting, all suitably socially distanced. The witnesses and my other colleagues are in their homes and offices across the country and indeed in one case outside the country. This evidence session is the first in our inquiry on English devolution, and I'm very grateful to all the witnesses who have given up their time to be here with us today. Could I please ask you to introduce yourselves?
Good morning, my name's Sarah Ayres. I'm Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Bristol.
Good morning, my name is Arianna Giovannini. I am an Associate Professor in Local Politics and Public Policy and the Deputy Director of the Local Governance Research Centre at the Montfort University.
Good morning, I'm Mike Kenny. I'm Director of the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge.
Good morning, my name is Richard Wyn Jones. I am, for these purposes, co-director of the Future of England survey, which is the most detailed look at attitudes in England towards the way that the country is governed, and author of a book called Englishness, the Political Force Transforming Britain, jointly written with Elsa Henderson, coming out next year with Oxford University.
Thank you all. And can I now turn to our first question, which is from my colleague John Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. Could I start with Professor Kenny? How would you describe the current position of governance arrangements in England?
Sure. I guess I'd say three things to start with. First of all, highly centralised in character. England is one of the most centralised large democracies in the developed world, with a state that's still making decisions and developing policies for many different places some of which it has little understanding. Secondly, I think I'd suggest that the governance of England is in some ways constitutionally increasingly problematic in a union where devolution has developed for other parts of the kingdom, and by a sort of process of subtraction, the UK government has in some key respects become England's government, and that, it seems to me, stretches or puts a strain on the British constitutional tradition. And then thirdly, I'd suggest that the governance of England is increasingly opaque from a citizen's perspective, with local authority structures that sit quite awkwardly alongside some mismatching bodies with overseeing, policing, health and other public service powers, and in some places an increasingly complicated layering of different tiers of authority.
Thank you. Dr. Giovanni.
Thanks very much. I fully agree with the points that Mike raised. I think it's important to emphasize that due to the reason that Mike just explains, devolution in England remains an unfinished business that lacks a clear framework and direction of travel. And until now, it's important to underline that devolution has developed in fits and starts, leaving devolution deals to resemble a patchwork of ad hoc fixes that do not cover the whole country and vary considerably in terms of power, resources, responsibility that are passed down to local and combined authorities. So the problem there is that as a result of this, devolution remains a disconnected project that benefits only some areas across England, with the tendency of privileging metropolitan ones and exclude rural and coastal areas, and is still far from delivering any form of real empowerment and autonomy to all localities. There is something to be said, perhaps also about the fact that devolution can be achieved now at the moment only through deals with central government. And this fosters competition rather than cooperation between local authorities. And this is problematic because it means that while devolution was set with the aim of bridging existing socioeconomic divides, in practice, the competitive nature of devolution deal makings leads to the creations of winners and losers of devolution, adding in this way new divides to existing ones. I think what has been happening in the north of England is a case in point. So in there we see that with the exception of the Tees Valley, it is the big cities, Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, and now Leeds soon, that are benefiting from devolution. While areas that are experiencing highest levels of socioeconomic deprivation, such as Hull or Blackpool, for example, have been left at the margin. So this is something that needs to be changed going forward, because in order to work properly, I think it's important that devolution really reconciles the different socioeconomic aspects of the country and really finds a way to address them and being accessible to all areas and not just a few selected ones.
Okay. Professor Jones.
Professor Wyn Jones.
Oh, sorry, I do apologise. I don't have very much to add to what what my two colleagues have just said. It is deeply confused. English local government is well known to be very weak. That kind of intermediate level is incoherent, confused. There is no underpinning basic consensus as to what that level is meant to be achieving. Frankly, if you spend, as I have recently, any time looking at the evolution of that kind of intermediate level governance in England over the last 20, 25 years, you really do need to wrap a wet towel around your head, because it is, and I say this as somebody who's used to Welsh devolution, which has its moments, but English regional governance is just incoherent and very, very difficult, even for the so-called experts to follow, let alone the citizens, which returns to the point that Mike made, which I think is very important, that just in terms of the citizens, this is very, very difficult to understand.
Okay. Professor Ayres, you've said that the evolution of English devolution has lacked any clear constitutional vision. What do you think a clear constitutional vision would look like?
I think there's two options for the next phase of devolution at the moment. One is more of the same, what my colleagues have described, this sort of mishmash of top-down, technocratic, negotiated deal-making, which might be recognisable for those core elites charged with managing the process. It's an economic productivity agenda. Or there's a different vision, something perhaps a little more radical, something which offers genuine power and control for local people, those people that are affected by decisions. Patsy Healy, who does some work on this in Newcastle, talks about new imaginaries. And her argument is that we're so ingrained in the British political tradition of this top-down control that it's really difficult for us to see beyond that, to see what genuine devolution in England could look like. But there's a question whether post-Brexit, post-COVID, the time is right now for something a little more radical and imaginative.
Professor Kenny, what would be your vision?
Well, I'd say just add a couple of points to that. I think part of the obvious challenge here is that this is a state that lacks a constitutional vision even more widely than England. I mean, so we're focusing here obviously today on England, but the question of what is the constitutional vision for a UK which has a lot of different moving parts within it in terms of devolution and reforms is one thing, and where England locks into that wider set of changes is a very big question, a tough question, given that the way devolution has generally been undertaken since the millennium has been that this is about the other parts of the kingdom. And so England has been very disconnected from that process. I think secondly, I would very much go to the point about thinking about what devolution might mean outside this kind of contractual deal-making framework, which Sarah rightly points to. Now, I'm sure we'll discuss aspects of that. It seems to me there may be elements of the model of devolution we've got that we might want to keep and perhaps build from. And it seems to me some aspects of the combined authority and metro mayor model are valuable and important and are creating a new tier of leaders who can claim a mandate to speak for the people they represent. That's important, but their powers are very weak. They're symbolic authority. Their soft power seems fairly strong, and we're seeing an example of that right at the moment in relation to Greater Manchester. But this is a very constrained model by any kind of international comparison. And the point that this has evolved in a very top-down way. And I think this question about what is the underpinning view of this, what is the consensus, as Richard puts it, which is going to be shared to some degree across politics to build out devolution. I think that's a really important part of that question.
Dr. Giovannini?
I think that another point that needs to emphasize is that we need to, going forward, if we are to develop a functioning kind of long-term constitutional vision, we need to rethink also the way in which central-local relations work, especially within England. And this would allow to tackle both the elements of the so-called English question, so tackling over-centralization in England, while also rebalancing the role and place in England within the Union. And this requires really a profound rethinking of the way central-local relations work, and also a cultural shift at the center too, and one that opens up to the principle of subsidiarity and fully embraces the principle of subsidiarity and puts it at the core of a long-term constitutional vision for England and for the UK as a whole. And this is, of course, there is no doubt that this is a very difficult task, but it's one that would allow to reestablish a stronger relation between the centre and subnational governments in England, based on a clear allocation of power, cooperation, and also trust. And we should also perhaps try to look at what is happening also in other countries, because this is the norm in many other countries, for example, in Western Europe. And research clearly shows that the countries with functioning system of multi-level governance, they tend to perform better in terms of policy effectiveness and economic outcomes, Germany being the prime example here. However, this requires a form of devolution that is based on a clear division of power, fair allocation of funding, and cooperation mechanism of cooperative mechanism of collaboration between and across different levels of government. A long-term constitutional vision for England is very much needed and should really reflect on these points going forward.
Thank you. Professor Jones, just to finish on this point, it's clear all of you think that there are some serious problems with English devolution at present. Is this something our Royal Commission should be looking at?
That's an interesting suggestion. I do think that that there are such basic issues where there is no consensus. So, for example, We've had mention of the wider UK context and devolution to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and what this might mean in England. And of course, there's a strong pressure historically from Welsh Labour MPs and Labour MPs from outside of England to push a regional devolution in England to counterbalance Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Although there is very little evidence that there's public support in England for such a development. So you have that fundamental tension. You've also had this problem going back over the last 20-25 years where because there has been no shared vision between the two largest parties in England, we've had things being set up, removed, new things put in their place, removed. There is a constant churn in this area. And so I think that while traditionally there is a view of royal commissions as being a way of kicking things into the long grass and not dealing with issues, when you have a fundamental lack of consensus between the two largest parties in England, there is an argument for some mechanism, I think, where discussions take place, whether it's in some kind of citizens' assembly or in some kind of commission, I don't know, but it seems to me that one of the reasons we have such churn and such incoherence is there's a lack of basic agreement on even the boundaries of a regional level or a intermediate level in England, let alone what the functions of that level might be. And until we have at least some kind of agreement about that, I suspect that there will be future meetings like this in 10, 20 years' time, saying, well, what do we do about English governance? It's a mess.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I'd like to follow up on the point that Professor Wyn Jones just made with Dr. Giovannini. The issue of the appetite for devolution in England. As you know, in 2004, the then Labour government was keen to set up a number of regional assemblies across England. In the northeast, that was resoundingly defeated by a huge majority. What indication does that give of the then and the current appetite for devolution in England?
Well, having conducted extensive research on the failed attempt to set up a regional assembly in the northeast of England in 2004, I think that in broad terms, it is misleading to think that the 2004 referendum was an example that shows that there is no appetite for devolution among local communities. I think it would be more accurate to read that episode as a way of saying that people in the northeast did not vote against devolution itself, but they voted against that specific form of regional devolution, which, if we look at the details, it was very much less than satisfactory. And in fact, what was on offer and put to the vote in 2004 was a very weak form of devolution. It was a form of devolution that really didn't do much in the way of empowering local communities. The regional assembly had virtually no power and funding, and as such, it would have not been able to bring about any real change in the region or act upon issues such as transport, training, adult education, or economic policy that can make a difference for people in their everyday life. So the main issue was that while the initial proposals for regional assemblies were ambitious, over time, the powers that were on offer were increasingly chipped away by the Treasury and the Cabinet at large. And so proposals for the regional assemblies were not developed in consultation with local leaders either. And local campaigns were active and sought to lobby central government, but they targeted the office of the Deputy Prime Minister, and they didn't manage to influence in an effective way the Cabinet's view. So the result was a regional assembly proposal that was packaged in London and imposed on the Northeast, with little consideration of the need to gather support from the grassroots and to win over consensus from local communities. So as such, what was on offer resembled more a form of functional top-down regionalization than any form of real political devolution. And so I think that it is unsurprising that people in the Northeast voted against the creation of new bodies with no powers, because this is not the same as saying, but this is not the same as saying that there is no appetite for devolution among the English. And in fact, if I can conclude with a couple of lessons, there are quite a few lessons that can be learned from what happened in 2004. The Northeast results, I think, showed that they really threw into sharp relief the long-standing reluctance on the part of Whitehall to let go of power in England, an attitude that was present back then in 2004 and is pretty much still persisting today. But this approach is a contradictory one because it leads to issues that still exist today. And any government willing to develop a coherent and functioning system of devolution going beyond party political interest cannot impose devolution on localities from the top down and expect to control it unilaterally from the center. So doing devolution properly requires a full commitment on the part of central government to relinquish power to and show trust in subnational government. Another common assumption that emerged from the result in 2004 referendum and that needs to be debunked, in my view, is the one about the regional scale. Again, people in the Northeast didn't vote against the idea of regional devolution per se. They just didn't want an empty, powerless regional body. And so the regional scale as a meso-level between local government and national government should not be discarded a priori in the debate on the form of the devolution should take going forward. And there is a lot of research from IPPR North, for example, which was also echoed by the reports of the UK 2070 Commission on Regional Inequality, that shows that a regional tier of government that doesn't suck up power from the local level, but is actually empowered from the center and provides policy direction and coordination on strategic policy issues while working in close contact with and being accountable to local government, could provide the missing link between the center and the local level that we are currently experiencing in England. And so thinking about a regional tier of governance should not be dismissed just because the people in the Northeast voted against a weak regional body in 2004.
Thank you for that. Of course, the point is that that is the only official poll that we've had on devolution in England so far. And as I said, it was resoundingly rejected. Your thesis is that it was rejected, as I understand it, because it didn't go far enough. Yeah. Have you any polling evidence to show that there is more support now in the Northeast for devolution than there clearly was in 2004?
I don't have a polling, but I can draw back to an example of citizens' assemblies on devolution that were conducted in different parts of England, one being Sheffield, for example, and one in Southampton. These were pilot citizens' assemblies that asked the question, that asked the people in these two areas what they think about devolution and whether they want devolution for the local areas. And the result of that was that, yes, there is a desire for devolution, but for a form of devolution that can really make a difference to people in their day-to-day life. And so this goes back to my main point. It depends on what we put on offer to citizens. It's not that people do not want devolution, people in England do not want devolution per se. I think that what they want is to see more power being passed down and having a local level and perhaps even a regional or city regional level that has empowered enough and has the resources to bring about, to work on policy that can really make a difference in their everyday life.
Professor Wyn Jones, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, I'm afraid that I want to disagree with my esteemed colleague in as much as I'm sorry to say that the evidence that is not there to support the contention that if what had been offered in 2004 had been stronger, there would have been a different result at the time. The fact of the matter is that those of us who spent quite a long time looking at attitudes in England towards the governance of England find that there is very little support for regional devolution. In fact, the only thing that has less support than regionalism is city deals, in fact. The people who are arguing in favour of a kind of intermediate level of governance in England may well have a very good functional case. England is incredibly centralised by any standard, but I'm afraid that you can't really make the argument on the basis of the public in England demands something different. One of the issues, of course, is the boundaries. In 2004, the then government cherry-picked the North East as the area they thought they would find the highest support for a regional elected assembly, and obviously we know the results. Many people have suggested, well, the problem is the boundaries. It's that people in England have no sense of effective identification with these particular government regions. So we've also spent time polling on other boundaries, like the North, for example. But we struggle to find any support, public kind of demand for regional governance in England at any level. At any regional level, the major cities, the major conurbations are different. So London is clearly different in that regard. But I'm afraid that in terms of, there may well be some very strong arguments for a regional or an intermediate level of governance in England, but public attitudes isn't the kind of the trump card if you want to win that argument, in my view.
That's what your studies have indicated. Have you got any polling evidence that you could point to?
Yeah, we have a lot of polling evidence, some of which is published, and there is some more recent. In fact, I did, in talking to one of your colleagues on the committee, I did offer if it was of interest to the committee to pull together a short report on the latest polling evidence and survey evidence.
Can I take you up on that kind offer, please? Thank you.
You may.
Thank you. Professor Kenny.
Just a couple of observations really on coming out of that discussion. One is I think we should be a little bit careful about drawing too many hard and fast lessons from that particular referendum, if only because there's an important political context, I think, surrounding it. One of which is that and in some ways this is, I think, a harbinger of things that have happened since. The campaign to defeat that proposition was a kind of early example of a sort of anti-establishment campaign in a referendum that gathered pace and really targeted what it framed as a kind of very top-down metropolitan way of thinking about an area. And I think, and I say that not just because Dominic Cummings was involved in that campaign, but it really does, I think, indicate how far back we can go to think about the process of some traditional Labour voting communities beginning to become disaffected with Labour's thinking in questions of governance. And also there was a European dimension to this, an EU dimension, in that it was the accusation that this was a project that fitted with the EU vision of the Europe of the regions, which was also a very powerful card. So that's one thing. I think the second thing, on following Richard's points about identity, I think it is important to reflect on questions about whether the kind of, when bureaucratically we want to draw up lines of division in England, what may make sense entirely at the functional level, in functional terms, whether that kind of approach fits with many people's sense of the geographies that matter to them. There are sort of traditions, geographically bounded forms of identity, be it counties, be it cities, be it villages, towns, which run very deeply in England. That's not unique to England, but there are specifically English traditions and dimensions of that. And I think the lesson there to reflect on is that a governance project that doesn't have that kind of geographical dimension, doesn't have some sense of a geography that makes some sort of sense to people with which they can connect, is, I think, going to be up against it. It's going to be harder to make that fly, which again is not an argument against an intermediate layer at all, but I think it is, in some ways, I think it's a pointer towards the sort of geography that in rough and ready terms we're moving towards with combined authorities and city regional deals.
Do you have anything to add, Professor Ayres?
Just a quick point, picking up on Richard's point really about a lack of public support for devolution. I think one of the key problems is that the narrative, the vision hasn't been spelt out. It's hard to buy into a vision that's never been articulated effectively. So when the devolution deals came round, for example, lots of research pointed to the fact that there were strong central devolution champions in Westminster in the form of George Osborne and Greg Clark. Now that was seen as massively important in driving forward the devolution agenda, providing impetus at the centre and providing a vision. But if there's no vision set out, then it's difficult for the public to know what they may or may not be buying into. So it has to start at the centre, really.
How fair might it be to observe that it's possibly the case that people have got enough politicians already and don't want any more?
That's one of the big concerns by all accounts, and Richard will know better of the details of that, but another layer of bureaucracy apparently is the big no-no for local actors. But that said, if there's no understanding about what they could offer, I mean, picking up on Professor Kenny's point about having the right territorial dimension to this, people have an affinity with their cities, they do have an affinity with place. The COVID crisis has brought that into sharp relief. So has the Brexit crisis. So, if you get the geography right, if you get the vision right, and there's an offer of the possibility of doing something different, the public will respond.
But not necessarily positively.
Not necessarily.
No.
It will be variable, different parts of the country, no doubt.
Professor Wyn Jones, I think you wanted to come back.
Could I add just one very quick observation? One of the difficulties with the whole debate about that intermediate level of government in England is it's been pitched very often as a choice between recognising England as a unit and recognising an intermediate level within England, as if you have to choose between them. Now, logically, they're not. There's no necessary connection, but that's how it's been proposed, in particular by the centre-left. And public attitudes in England are very, very clear. I mean, you can measure this in all kinds of different ways, but you get the same conclusion. If they're forced to choose between regional governance within England and recognising England as a unit, people in England overwhelmingly choose recognising England. And one of the problems that those who advocate regional devolution within England have had is that they've tended to pitch that against England and Englishness and recognising England. And that's an argument that they simply cannot win.
Thank you. A quick supplementary now from Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
I think you've raised some really interesting questions there, particularly Professor Jones, around Englishness versus regionalisation. How's that played out in terms of places like Cornwall, or maybe even places like Yorkshire, where there is already a relatively strong regional identity? There's regional newspapers in one, or regional, whilst or previously dead, a slightly growing regional language and understanding of regional identity in Cornwall. And has part of the problem been that even in your poll, it's always around trying to create functional units first, rather than trying to create cultural units that might be very small. Cornwall has the population of Malta, but nobody ever really talks seriously about Cornwall being a devolved nation within the UK. I mean, is that part of the problem, that we've always looked at the function rather than the culture?
That's an interesting point, and I'm afraid that my research continues the tradition that you've just condemned, because we simply don't have a large enough sample in Cornwall. We do our best in England, and we've certainly spent a lot of time trying to do samples which are big enough to get us a relatively good understanding of the differences within England, and I'll come back to those in a moment. But I'm afraid that I can't tell you much about Cornwall specifically, because it's simply too small. But there's an interesting question there, but I can't answer it. Very quickly, in terms of attitudes across England, one of the interesting things is that there's, with the partial exception of London, there's actually a great deal of uniformity across England. There are, as Professor Kenny was saying, there are clearly deeply felt identity differences within England, but in terms of them having any political manifestation in terms of the territorial governance of England, that you just don't find England is quite uniform in not being interested in this stuff. And so we, as I said, we've tried different units. We've tried the government official units. We've tried what may be kind of effective units like the North, and we have not found that sense of effective identity that might underpin a different form or an intermediate level of governance for England, and that. So it's
both those units that you mentioned. Both those units that you mentioned sound deeply unappealing to me. But Cornwall, Yorkshire, even Sussex sounds much more appealing. But if you suddenly asked me whether I'd want a functional unit with Sussex and Kent, I'd be very much against it. I just wonder if that even this is always looking at the wrong way. And these identities were created, a lot of them created in the Victorian era and constructed. A lot of county identities were constructed, and I wonder if, rather than trying to look at governance, we need to be looking at constructing cultural units first, and then saying to people, do you want some governance to come along with that cultural unit that we've now constructed and made you feel empowered?
Yeah, I mean, as you probably worked out from my accent, or indeed my name, I'm not English, so it's not really my, what you say makes emotional sense to me. But if you look at the way this debate has been pitched over the last 25 years, it's different. We've been trying to look at attitudes in England at the kinds of levels that have been spoken about. And you, as I said earlier, you really struggle to find popular support for that kind of devolution. But as I said, you also find a lack of popular support for city regions, at least in the abstract sense. Now, maybe if you spoke about particular localities, you'd get something different, but that would be a very different kind of survey than the one that we're doing.
Thank you. And a quick additional contribution from Professor Kenny, please.
Just very quickly, I think it is a really important question, this, of how do you relate a sort of place-defined sense of connection or belonging to some new form of governance. But this is a challenge that it's not unique to England. I mean, it's a challenge you can see right across democratic contexts that try to decentralize and so on. And I think, whilst I do think that geography is important and cultural tradition matters and can set a limit, and I think that may be true in the regional governance case, it's also true that sometimes developing governance innovations, just making change happen, even if there isn't a sort of massive surge in demand, and you build something that works, and then people start to connect with it. And I do think Wales is a very interesting case in point, in a sense, to look at, where over time you've seen a very significant shift in people's attitudes towards devolution. And it seems to me that there are examples you can build upon, in other words, without necessarily waiting for that very clear cultural consensus, because we just don't have it in most parts of England, yet we know that we need a much more functional model of intermediate devolution.
Thank you for that. I'm going to now ask Karen Smith to ask the next question.
Thank you, Chair.
But before I do that, could I gently say that we are running rather slowly at the moment, so could we have snappy questions and possibly snappy answers, and if witnesses don't feel constrained to put an answer in, they needn't worry about it. Thank you very much. Karen.
Thank you, Chair. And Professor Ayres, would like to move to you and talk about some devolution deals. Specifically, in 2015, as we know, the Conservative government launched the devolution deals, and in Bristol-based, so we had one of those, didn't we? To what extent do you think these measures are described as devolution or decentralisation, with power and responsibility?
So in 2015, there were ambitious plans to devolve powers to those localities that were willing to take on an elected mayor. I mean, the narrative at the time was that this was a devolution revolution, that would lead to a fundamental reconfiguration of powers between the centre and localities. I did quite a lot of work looking at devolution deals between 2015 and 2018. The upshot of that work was that there's a big rhetoric reality gap. So the reality of what the devolution deals looked like didn't quite match up to the rhetoric of a revolution at the time. What you've ended up with is a set of very different set of relationships across England. So on the one hand, you had Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which was seen as the gold standard, the model of devolution that others could follow, although you do wonder if recent events around COVID is going to undermine some of those relationships in quite a damaging way for the next phase of devolution. Then you had a set of devolution deals which were quite hard won, which were described as bruising experiences. Some localities felt strong-armed into the mayor approach or the deal that they got. And then you have a set of localities where there's no deal at all. And a colleague, Jennings, called them the forgotten areas, our coastal towns and rural areas, which are completely sidelined by any possible benefits of devolution. So rather than this narrative of a devolution revolution and a fundamental reconfiguration of powers, we've probably ended up with a piecemeal, very asymmetric set of relationships which perhaps haven't quite delivered up to the promise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And the next question is from David Mundell.
Thank you. Earlier in the evidence, it was said that the UK is one of the most centralised states in Europe. And I wonder your views, starting with you, Professor Kenny. the extent to which you think devolution in 1997 changed this?
I mean, in some senses, it did change it for Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, undoubtedly, with asymmetric devolution arrangements introduced in those places. I mean, there's an interesting argument about whether decentralisation within each of them has followed, because clearly devolution has created new power centres, particularly in Scotland. But in England, it's been a very different story. And following on from what Professor Ayres is saying, I mean, the devolution model in England has unfolded very, very differently in fits and starts. It's much more akin to administrative devolution. It's not so obvious that structure has created that much decentralisation. And the other point I'd make is that for decentralisation, excuse me, to happen, the mindset within the centre has to change. And I think we've created these variable devolution structures, but for the most part, the centre has retained the presumption that it still is in control, and that devolution in a substantive way has only happened outside England.
I certainly agree with you that although we've had devolution to Scotland, Scotland itself remains incredibly centralised, much to the disappointment of many. Do any of our other witnesses wish to comment on that, on the post-99 impact? Professor Wyn Jones.
I mean, I think in terms of the governance of England, there's a strong argument for saying that it's become more centralised since 97, as both parties, despite their rhetoric, hoover up powers from local governments and into central government. And we're now seeing the latest iteration of this around planning, where local government is set to lose planning powers. Now, there may be arguments why that is a necessary thing, but let's be very clear, it's reducing the powers of local government. So there is this, I mean, it's been observed many times, there's this paradox, whereas we've had substantial devolution of powers to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, yet England is probably becoming more centralised. And very little has changed at the UK level. And actually when you look at the various proposals that the main parties have put forward for English governance since 97, very, very, very few of them actually address the power of the central states. That taking powers away from the central states is not what this is about. Often it's moving up powers from local governments.
Professor Wyn Jones, if I may just interject there, but is it not arguable that the same process of centralisation has actually manifested itself in both Scotland and Wales since devolution?
It's certainly an argument, Chair, and I'm sure we could have that argument. All I would say is that I think that local government, if you compare local government in Wales in particular to England, it retains more of its traditional functions around, for example, education than a local government in England does these days.
Thank you.
But I mean, following up both with you, Professor Wyn Jones and Professor Kenny, and indeed our other witnesses wish to, I mean, has any of the regional initiatives pursued in England by either the previous Labour government or the Conservative government done anything at all to decentralise power? I'll go back to you, Professor Kenny.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, the picture that Richard paints is definitely recognisable. I think there's a lot to that. I think that there is a countervailing tendency. I mean, I think the restoration of government for London and the introduction of the GLA was an important moment in terms of developing a system, returning some powers to London, and actually developing a functional and viable and important form of devolved government within the capital. I also think that some of the other innovations we've had, particularly Greater Manchester, are important counters to some degree to the tendency for the centre to bring powers back. I mean, having undertaken, I mean, it's not that people in the centre think that they're not doing devolution. There's been a lot of rhetoric, endless reports about this. But it's true that it's been done in a sort of fairly centralised way. But at the same time, having created an entity like Greater Manchester and having an elected mayor and having developed an authority that has the most substantial set of powers, we do now have a model of some kind of slightly less insipid form of devolution. And I do think the mandate that comes from being elected for the leader of that authority, and indeed I think it would be fairly true of West Midlands as well, that we have some examples now which run against that tendency. But I do accept that those authorities are working in a very constrained context, and the sort of deal-making contractual framework within which they work is a huge inhibition.
Dr. Giovannini?
I think it's also very important to be careful when we think about the creation of models of devolution. So Mike rightly pointed out to the example of Greater Manchester. It is true that in some places we've seen a bit of there has been an attempt at passing down powers, but we don't have to think that a model that works in Manchester can be applied to other places too. So that is a very, very risky approach, and something that again would privilege particularly metropolitan areas and create the process of exclusion from the areas that have been left behind so far from the process of devolution. Going back to your initial question about whether anything has been achieved in terms of devolution since 1997, I think that what we've seen both back in the days of the Labour government and now, there are elements of continuity in this process. The main point being that devolution is understood as a way of addressing persisting regional inequalities across England. Now, that could be one of the aims of devolution, but it is not necessarily the only one. And even if that was the aim of devolution, if we look at evidence from research, for example, when I was interim director at IPPR North last year, we developed a comprehensive set of research that looks at what is happening to regional inequalities. And we found that are still growing, and that over-centralization is the root cause of these regional inequalities. So by that count, I think it's fair to say that devolution has not worked very well so far. And perhaps what we have seen is not real devolution, but some form of delegation of some powers and responsibilities to subnational levels of government. But we need to, if we want to achieve devolution, we need to take into account also the democratic element of that as well. And there must be a willingness on the part of the centre to pass down real powers and resources to local leaders in all areas in England, so that they can take the lead and adopt really place-based approach to addressing those persisting inequalities that we see in the country.
Okay.
I think Professor Ayres, did you want to add something?
Two very quick points. Picking up on Professor Kenny's point about a step change in Greater Manchester, one of the things that springs to mind for me was the devolution of functions and some powers around health and social care. Now that's a massive step for Whitehall and Westminster, because the Department of Health has historically been very nervous, as have all the big delivery departments, about devolution. So that provides an opportunity for what might happen. But the second point is to make that nothing was devolved in the devolution deals that central government was not willing to let go of. So there was two key considerations with the devolution deals. Can you do it better? Can you do it cheaper? If so, we'll think about it. But, nothing was taken, everything was granted. And that was the context within which deals were made.
Thank you. Next question from Karen Smith.
Thank you, Chair. And following on Professor Ayres on those points, and I think this discussion is still concentrating on very much what comes out of London rather than what comes up. So the question is really around this sort of small-scale, incremental approach that we've had now, and whether that works in regard to English local government and devolution. And we started off saying that decision making now is rather opaque in England. I think that was Professor Wyn Jones. And locally we've got 3 mayors, and we've got a city mayor, a regional mayor that covers part of the city area, and we've got a Lord Mayor, and that I know confuses many people. But this incremental way now, how with local government, do you want to talk us through a little bit how you see whether that's working or not?
Yeah, of course. So this idea that deals are made, or devolution deals, the last round of the devolution reforms have been made on a piecemeal basis. So each local area has entered negotiations with central government to find a deal appropriate and fit for purpose. On the one hand, that's probably a sensible strategy moving forward, because there are high degrees of variability in local governance capacity across England. Some areas will want to pursue the full suite of those possibilities, other areas won't. So that incremental process, rather than sweeping constitutional reforms across England, feel appropriate. And then just picking up on your point about how these deals were made, largely behind political elites from the centre and localities, behind closed doors, very little formal government guidance, and they happened very quickly, so there was not much time for consultation. When I interviewed stakeholders who were at the heart of this process, there were some very clear positives out of that. One, an ability to talk through some of the more difficult discussions behind closed doors without the media spotlight. And the recent COVID crisis and pandemic and tensions brought to the fore highlight some of the negative consequences of a public fallout. The other issue was that they were able to speak about innovative solutions that might never see the light of day. There was trust building between parts of central government and the local areas. So there was lots of positives to this sort of fleet of foot, behind closed doors way of working. The downside, of course, is that if you're not on the inside, you don't know what's going on. And an agenda that is supposed to be about bringing power and decision making to local people was seen as exclusionary, elitist and top down. So I think the challenge for government and the next round of the devolution agenda is to try and strike this balance between a sort of fleet of foot, flexible approach, the sort of incremental approach, but also a system and a way of working that's going to engender a spirit of confidence and goodwill amongst the public. So lots of the deals fell apart when they were announced, and people that were not consulted didn't approve it. It makes implementation very difficult, things fall apart. So striking that balance, I think, will be crucial to how future agendas work.
But how do you see the voting public and ultimately the taxpayers who are paying for this being involved to get us to that next stage? As you say, it's very variable across the country. And I would agree that we've learnt a lot actually on both sides. But how do we democratically bring the public with us on that?
Absolutely, because it takes time and it takes energy. And I think lots of the people involved in the process were nervous. So, for example, a colleague has done some work around the Greater Manchester deal, and by all accounts, the insiders were very nervous about an open public consultation because they felt that it would scupper any plans they had to actually move the deal forward. So, it's about selling it firstly to the political elite charged with driving forward the process, and you do sympathise with them to some degree. But Ed Cox makes an interesting point where he was saying now that the devolution genie is out the bottle and we have actually got devolution and it's, we're off first base, it might be easier this round to consult the public because we are on a moving trajectory, whereas getting the initial devolution deals off the ground was so complicated and so challenging that perhaps you needed that sort of closed shop working in order to get the process going.
Thank you. Professor Kenny, you look like you wanted to add to that point.
Sorry, I think I was just having a cough, actually.
Oh, you're okay.
I very much agree with everything Professor Ayres says. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, just to amplify it slightly, I think the idea that this is evolving and that there is learning to be done here from the first round of experiences is very important. I do think having a much greater focus in the next round upon what you're talking about is these authorities engaging downwards and bringing the public with them, thinking about themselves as civic entities, not just as entirely focused upon productivity or economic growth. I think that's absolutely the next step in this.
Thank you. And Dr. Giovannini, you look like you wanted to add this local government issue.
Yes, exactly on that, adding a point also on local government. First of all, I agree with what has been said so far and fully agree with Sarah. The only point that I would add to that is that, yes, it is possible to maintain an incremental approach, but I think that there is one risk and something that needs to be addressed there if we want to keep an incremental approach. Firstly, if this incremental approach remains competitive, while it's correct that not all areas might have the institutional capacity to take on board a full suite of devolution straight away, if the process is competitive, well, that means those areas that don't have that institutional capacity will struggle to get in. It pushes them out of the game, essentially. And so that, again, reinforces and creates new inequalities and competition. And those areas that are lagging behind and really need to benefit from devolution will not benefit from it. So that's a problem. And to address that, I think it's important to think that we need to have a clear roadmap for devolution. Yes, it can be incremental, but what is the end point? Where do we want to get within a specific time frame? A final point on local government. I think another issue that we have seen in the process so far is there have been constant attempts dating back from the 2000s to conflate devolution with local government reorganization. Well, devolution and local government reorganization are not the same thing and should not be conflated. And I think that doing that is coming in the way and is becoming an obstacle to achieve a proper system of devolution in England.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Professor Wyn Jones,
on this point,
I think.
Professor Jones?
Yeah. I think you're muted.
The mute button.
You're muted. You're muted. You're muted, I think, Professor Wyn Jones.
I do apologise, Chair. Some technical difficulties. Can I just interject with a note of, I guess, scepticism? We've been here before. So if you look at the history of that kind of intermediate level of government, and if you go back to the turn of the century, you had regional development agencies, you had voluntary regional chambers. There was a process which is actually akin in some ways to the one that Sarah has described around these regional devolution deals. They were top-down, elite-driven conversations which appeared to be developing a momentum. You got another party in which didn't buy into the vision. It all just fell away. The problem with these elite-level deals is that once the elite moves on, unless there's some kind of consensus around boundaries, and the example of the 3 mayors in Bristol is brilliant, isn't it? I mean, it just shows what happens when you get this incremental process with no vision, no consensus. And so I have to say I'm very sceptical about the likely longevity of the arrangements that we currently have in England, because there isn't buy-in. You know, we heard mention of George Osborne, who he, frankly, these days. I think that the people who came up with that vision have gone. It's not at all clear that the present incumbents have the same vision. So go back to the point about consensus building around boundaries, around functions.
Just on that, though, I would say that we now have situations across England where there are people and organisations in place, so therefore something has to happen in order to move it on, because the status quo won't continue in counter to that. Elites moving on, I think. But thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And now back to David Mundell.
Thank you, Chair. Beginning with Professor Ayres, can I ask what you think the main differences in the impetus and purpose of devolution within England has been compared to devolution to the nations? For example, I mean, back in the 90s, George Robertson, the then Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, said that devolution would kill independence stone dead, and that was, for example, a reason for doing it.
So in the academic literature, there's an acceptance that quite often devolution is motivated by 3 key things. The first is a drive for economic productivity. The second is a drive for a devolution of power to local actors, bringing decision-making closer to people. And the third is about transforming public services. So to some degree, all devolved territories in England have been shaped by those three motivations. But I think in the devolved territories, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, there's been this drive for the democratic element that has been completely lacking in England, as Professor Wyn Jones has been talking about. But it is important, I think, to say that these drives and this bottom-up impetus, the public support for devolution in different parts of the UK, is constantly ebbing and flowing. It's a temporal process. So post-COVID, or in the midst of COVID, we've seen significant increases in the support for Scottish independence. You'd imagine public support for the Northern Ireland Assembly has probably hit rock bottom when it was disbanded, leading to massive problems in public services. And in Wales, there's been this slow burner of support over a period of time. So I think the same is true for the potential for English, some form of English devolution. So Lord Hennessy was on the radio earlier this week, and I was listening to him with some interest, where he was saying that COVID has brought to sharp relief these constant divisions within the UK constitution between the devolved nations and England, between North and South. And his argument actually is that perhaps, there's been this increased public consciousness of place and space. And although we haven't had this bottom-up appetite in England for a democratic strand to devolution in the same way as we have in the devolved territories, perhaps post-COVID, because the problems are so great that they can only be solved at a local level, it might reignite or ignite some kind of impetus for a bottom-up call for democracy in England in a way that hasn't shaped devolved arrangements in the past.
Does anyone want to add to that? Okay. Now the next question is from Tom Randall.
Thank you, Chair. We've spoken about common ground and roadmaps going forwards. Professor Kenny, you've suggested that there are two contending perspectives on English devolution that have developed since 1997, and they've been increasingly associated with different approaches from the Conservative and Labour parties. Do you think there's a way to reconcile these different perspectives?
Let me just start by just fleshing out a little bit what are the perspectives. I mean, this is very much, I think, goes to the question about consensus or lack of, which Richard has been talking about here. So thinking about why is it that different parts of the political world in Britain, in British politics, think so differently about these issues? Is it just a sort of Punch and Judy partisanship? I think there's something more to it than that, and there's undoubtedly a partisan element to it. But it seems to me that it reflects quite a divergent view about England itself, and that there is one perspective which has been much more comfortable with the idea that England is an English identity is valuable, is important to people, and that England itself may be some kind of collective community which may have its own interests as well as identity. And then on the other hand, you've got a perspective which is much more primed to think in regional terms and tends to think that claims about Englishness are either illusory or they're reactionary. And that's been a strong impulse, I think, in different parts of the political world, but I think particularly on the centre-left of it. And those two different perspectives, I mean, there are people, I should say, who break the mold. There are people on the more conservative side who have become very interested in regional questions. Lord Heseltine is an interesting example. And people on the Labour or Liberal side of the debate who have argued for Englishness being taken more seriously and perhaps even given some recognition. But it seems to me that when the different parties get in government, there's a kind of default to these two very different perspectives, and that those perspectives lead you to think about the intermediate layer, or indeed to think about devolution at the level of England in very different ways. And until there's some kind of, I think, sort of richer interchange between them, where people start to think about some of the devolution both at the level of England, but also think about some of the layers within it that we've been discussing, we're going to have this kind of ping-ponging between these two very different views. And I very much endorse Richard's points about we do need a richer debate here within politics, and perhaps one that stands back a little bit from this kind of partisanship, because it is producing very incoherent policy.
Professor Wyn Jones.
The only thing I would add to that is that there was a brief moment around 2015 when I thought that there was going to be, we were seeing more of a consensus between Labour and the Conservatives on this. Until that point, the Conservatives basically, to very crudely caricature, the argument was, we don't want regional governance within England. What we want is English votes for English laws to counterbalance devolutions of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. Labour, on the other hand, was saying we want some kind of regional solution, and we're dead against any kind of recognition of England as England. In 2015, there appeared to be some kind of coming together, in as much as that we got evil. It looked then as if the Conservatives were getting interested in kind of regional deals and doing things within England, so England and intermediate level governments within England. It looked briefly as if Labour was accepting that English votes for English laws might have to happen. In 2017, we had England's manifesto commitment to a minister for England, which seemed to suggest that maybe, okay, we can do England and something within England, but that the Labour has lost all interest in that, it would appear. So I think we may be reverting back to, we'll see if the Conservatives maintain the interest in the regional level. I think that remains to be seen with this administration. But there was a brief moment where I thought that there might be a coming together, but my momentary optimism has now dissipated.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the next question is from Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Chairman. My questions are mainly for Professor Wyn Jones, who I have to say I share your cynicism for the top-down metropolitan view of devolution. And certainly my constituents in Thurrock, which is borders Greater London, are probably more defined by being not London than anything else. But they do have a very strong sense of being English. And you frankly, you see lots of George flags probably in Thurrock more than anywhere else. So, I mean, when I see the summaries of your Future of England surveys, what comes out of that is very familiar to me in terms of how my constituents feel. And there is actually a growing resentment of how England is treated in terms of devolution. I think many of my constituents would be quite happy if Scotland sailed off into the sunset, actually. But I'd just like to get your feedback on how else the unhappiness with how England is treated within the UK, how that dissatisfaction manifests itself. Please unmute.
Let me unmute myself. I'm being so solicitous with the muting, and well, I'm pleased that our analysis makes sense to you. There is one aspect of English dissatisfaction was Euroscepticism. There is the other aspect which we've termed, and I'm afraid this term hasn't caught on, but it's Devo anxiety, a sense that England gets unfairly treated within the UK. It's particularly focused on Scotland, in a sense that Scotland gets too much of the cake, so to speak. So there's a lot of resentment around that, and you know, the evidence is there. But I think there's something that I would maybe use this opportunity to draw your attention to. One of the things I find most interesting about English attitudes, and attitudes specifically associated with feeling English, is that there's a low sense of what political scientists call political efficacy, a sense that your voice matters, that somebody cares about what you think. And we find in England that people with a strong sense of English identity feel that the system doesn't listen to them, is not interested in their voice. And this is different, and this makes the English different from the Welsh in Wales, or there's something very interesting about this, and the book that we're publishing soon explores some of this, and And it is a sense, I think, a sense of that the state, and I'm putting myself in the English, so imagine an English accent. The state that was once mine is no longer mine. It's no longer interested in I've become alienated from it. And interestingly, thus far, there's no evidence. Obviously, Brexit hasn't fully happened yet in the sense of the transition out. But there's no evidence that this has changed fundamentally since 2016 so far. So this sense of lack of efficacy, apologies for using the political science jargon, it's still very, very obvious. And I'm not clear that anything that's happening at the moment is going to challenge that fundamentally.
I totally understand what you mean. Because if you view the Brexit vote as really, as much as anything else, frustration that the political class isn't representing the people who voted for it, and it expresses itself in various ways, and the Brexit vote was one of them. Those areas of the country where there is less regionalism and more Englishness are the ones that voted more heavily to leave. So I think that would express, sort of demonstrate your thesis.
But the only thing I'd add to that is you don't really find a part of England with a strong sense of regionalism in the sense of we want regional governments. Yes, you find strong regional identities in England, but those don't necessarily link to any sense of any sense that we demand recognition in terms of a territorial.
Apart from London.
Apart from London, yes.
Yeah, London is its own microcosm and arguably the only place where regional government works in England, but that's probably a discussion for another day.
Could I just interrupt here, please, Jackie? I see that Professor Kenny is asked to come in, and I think that David Mundell wanted to come in on the last point. So, Professor Kenny, can you go first, and then David, if you can come in briefly afterwards, please.
Very briefly, I think it's worth picking out as well something that I know is very difficult to poll on, and we don't have that much evidence about specifically, but I think is part of the story, the picture really that Richard's polling finds, which is about people's feeling towards the centre itself, towards power in London. It seems to me that one important aspect of this, and I include people who live in outer London, who are likely to feel like this, as people who live in other non-metropolitan areas. There's something, I think, particular about the way in which people outside our largest city centres in England begin to feel about the system of government, about how politics works, whether they get recognised, whether they get listened to, the efficacy point there. And I think there's, in some ways, what appears to have happened in the last decade or more, is that many people in England have come to feel about the centre the way in which people in Scotland and Wales do, the feeling that this is somehow out there on its own, is disconnected in terms of its policy priorities. And I think, whilst Richard's right, there isn't an obvious surge of a demand for a particular alternative model of devolution, but I think there is a strengthening of a very old sentiment. I mean, that kind of feeling about London is not new, but I think there's been something in the last 10 years that has gone rather unremarked there.
Thank you.
David, did you want to come in briefly?
Yes, the question I wanted to ask, which is sort of followed up from something Jackie said about her constituents' attitude to Scotland. I mean, is this issue of the extent to which, and I've based some of this in my own experience, people in England differentiate England from Britain? I mean, in Scotland, people have a very clear view, one way or the other, that Scotland compared to what is Britain or the United Kingdom. And my sense is that in England, that is not as clearly defined, and that many people's mindset, is one of equivalence rather than actually England is a constituent part of the United Kingdom.
Can I just respond quickly on the polling on that? It used to be the case in the mid-90s that when you tried to poll in England, differentiating, asking people, what mix of Britishness and Englishness that they felt. That you'd get kind of junk responses because people didn't really get the differentiation. They do get the differentiation now. But what's interesting about what I would term English nationalism is that it contrasts with Scottish, Welsh and Irish nationalism, because by now, it was different in the late 19th century, they tend to reject Britishness. English nationalism, for want of a better word, is both the sense that England isn't getting its fair dues within the UK, but a very, very strong loyalty to a particular sense of the British past, present and future. So it's not a rejection of Britishness in the same way that Welsh, Scottish and Irish nationalism have now. That's what they've become. So, I mean, there's obviously, David, there's a lot more that we can unpack there. But in terms of the response to your question, 30 years ago, if you tried to poll, you'd find that in England, people weren't really differentiating clearly between Englishness and Britishness. They do now, but what that means is something to be teased out further.
I think just following on from that, I mean, we've seen this manifest itself in voting against the European Union, but once we've left the EU, would you see this diva anxiety about Scotland and Wales becoming more acute?
I simply don't know. I mean, I think so much depends on I don't know. The honest answer is I don't know. And I'm going to just stop there because I know David told us not to talk too much. So
to ask the question in a slightly different way then, how do you think that the English people do want to be governed? Bearing in mind that we do recognise that there is this diva anxiety.
So I think there are paradoxes at work here, and so what that means is that you don't get a single coherent view. Within England, you get something that we sometimes call a devolution paradox, which is that people, in theory, want to see powers at a local level. However, they don't want to see any differentiation in public service provision. So they don't want to see the thing that follows from devolving power, which is differences in policy provision. And sorry, I'm just giving you, you're the policymakers, I'm just making things more difficult for you, because that is a very difficult one for those who think that you should devolve power, because people don't seem to want the consequences of devolving power. In terms of across the UK as a whole, there is a sense of, in England, that the UK should stay together. However, there's not a very strong sense of, for example, Northern Ireland could go, and that would not upset very many people in England, actually. But also, there's a sense that the Scots and the Scots in particular, but also the Welsh and the Northern Irish, can pay for their own services. Don't do their own thing. Don't expect us to pay for it.
Yes, right.
If they choose to do things differently, that would be, and also very, very, very strong support for English votes, for English laws. That principle, although actually most people don't realise it's happened.
Yeah, they don't really know what it means. It's a nice jargonistic thing. But
yeah, they don't know what it means. You're right, but a sense that it's unfair for people outside of England to be voting on things that only apply in England. That there's it's a kind of common sense that that's just not right.
So in that sense, there is an aptitude for a degree of England's self-government. But I mean, what's your feedback as regards that?
Yeah. So there's the support for the status quo in England is very low, right? But what people, I think Mike Kenny said this already, what people actually want is more incoherent. Right. There's no consensus behind any other model. But if people are forced to choose between England as a unit or regionalising within England, it's England every time.
Right, splendid. Anybody else anything to add to that?
Professor Kenny, I think, wants to come in.
Yeah.
Just a couple of quick additions. I mean, one, in terms of the question, how do the English want to be governed? I share the lack of certainty in an answer, and I think part of the point there is the English have never really been asked in this way.
Exactly.
And that's such an important temporal point. The devolution was offered in a completely different way to other parts of the UK, and of course introduced with referendums. And the question of whether the English want to have a greater say in determining their own destiny, either within their local areas or as a nation as a whole, has just not been posed in that way. And it's very important that we haven't had that sustained debate about it. We haven't had it in politics, we haven't had it at a popular level. And it seems to me, one of the really important things to reflect on in your work is to think how we might start to get that debate out there, have that discussion, because of course the prevailing assumption has been in the British system, we can take the consent of the English for granted. They're happy with this.
Yes,
they're largely
exactly.
with it. I would just add as well that I do think, that said, we haven't got too long to have the debate because, potentially, as you well know, a number of very difficult issues to do with the union are about to land. And I do think there's some of the evidence we're talking about here is often a kind of reactive. There's a reactive aspect to it. This is people in England who've not been thinking about devolution, not been encouraged to or taught about it very much, suddenly being confronted with issues which arise in the press or which politicians mention, and the sense that there is a reactive aspect to English opinion, and that will become important if there's a future referendum on Scotland, or if Northern Ireland that issue begins to evolve. That it seems to me very important that we need to really instigate a richer debate, a better understanding of the issues that are at stake.
Dr. Giovannini.
Thank you, Chair.
Dr. Giovannini, I think you wanted to add something.
Yes, thanks very much. Just a quick point on the fact that there is a kind of a stronger sense of English identity. There is a sense also that the English want more power, but we don't quite know exactly, what form should devolution take going forward. First point on that, I think that we have to be aware of the fact that when we talk about Englishness, perhaps we shouldn't look at it as a kind of a monolithic entity and understand and acknowledge the Englishness that people, yes, identify with a sense of Englishness, but that can take different connotations and forms in different parts of the country. I think it's undeniable that, for example, in the north of England, people might feel English, but that is not the same kind of Englishness of someone who lives in the south. So that's something to keep in mind. I would be wary of putting Englishness into a big box that kind of works in the same way across the country. And on the point on how do we think that the English people want to be governed, Richard says that evidence from the survey it shows that there is no support for some form of regional government. But couldn't that be because people can see that what we have at the moment isn't working and isn't enough? And so they don't want more of the same. Perhaps there is a need there to do a bit more of qualitative sort of investigation into what could be a working alternative. And that's why I pointed earlier on to that work done with the citizens' assemblies on devolution, because the report that came out from that really gives you that in-depth understanding of the fact that if people understand what devolution is for, what it can do, and if there are powers on offer, then they are supportive of it on a regional and subnational scale. There is also evidence from a BBC survey on Englishness and on how that linked to the view of people have on regional governments that actually shows that in some parts of the countries, especially in the north and in Cornwall, for instance, there is a strong sense of identification with the county dimension and the local dimension. So that should be taken into consideration too. There is other evidence there that suggests that perhaps we shouldn't look at England as one big block, and the analysis should be more nuanced.
Professor Ayres.
Just two quick points, picking up on what Professor Wyn Jones has said about what the English population think they want, if there's compared to a regional option or something English at the English scale. They might feel that they have a stronger affinity with an English identity and an English scale, but it won't solve the problems of disenfranchisement and feelings of alienation that were brought to bear in the Brexit debate. So I don't think that as a solution would work. And then the second point about, the devolution anxiety, some concerns about the Scottish getting, a larger slice of the cake. I think there's the potential for devolution anxiety with the current arrangements within England. So it was clear through the devolution deals that government perhaps had its preferred places to work with, that there was lots of effort and money going into some of the conurbations and less effort and focus in the rural and coastal towns and some of the other conurbations where devolution was going to be more problematic. So I think the current arrangements that we have could heighten those tensions, the devolution anxiety further within England.
Thank you. David Mundell.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to just come back, which I think Professor Kenny and others have touched on, to the issue of English votes for English laws, and whether that actually led to any discussion, debate in England on how England was governed and articulating an English voice. I think from what we've heard before, the answer is no, but I'd be interested just to hear what further you have to say on that.
Yes, I mean, I think that broadly, but is the answer, and that's for two reasons, isn't it? One is that the rules that make up the system of English votes for English laws are incredibly complicated, and not from. I mean, they've been running for 5 years now. It seems to me that the general sense of understanding of them and awareness of them is pretty low. I've not met many MPs either who profess affection for them, it should be said. But at the same time, I think that's partly because they haven't yet mattered, in the sense that because of the electoral arithmetic within the House, we've not yet had a moment where there is a disagreement between the majority of English MPs and the majority in favour of government policy. And so, as yet, we've not yet seen these rules being tested in that way. I think something else I'd add to this is that when EVIL was introduced, I mean, there were two broad ways of thinking about it. One was that it was a sort of way of, or quite a technical way of answering the West Lothian question in particular, which undoubtedly has been, when that arose in the second Blair government around two particularly controversial votes. The idea that there was a loophole here and that there was a potential sense that the opportunity for English grievance to grow and that something needed to be done. I think that was one reason why EVIL was introduced. But the other reason, if you look at the introduction of it, the official documents around it, there was quite a lot of big claims about this would give the English a voice, a distinctive voice within the system of parliamentary government. And a sort of hope, I think, that this would function as kind of analogous to the legislative consent process in the devolved parliaments. And it seems on that second point about voice, airing a stronger sense of English issues and interests and deliberation, it's really not worked at all. And that the legislative grant committees, which kick in on clauses or bills after report stage, I mean, they are mainly, as you probably know, very perfunctory, and they last really for hardly any time at all, and they haven't offered that kind of moment. So it seems to me that we can't look to that particular innovation as some sort of exemplar, a way of building up a sort of English presence or sort of form of recognition within the system. On the other hand, though, EVIL is potentially extremely important, and it's worth bearing this in mind. Because of the vagaries of our electoral system, it is entirely imaginable that we could, at the next election or the one after, have a situation in which the government that forms, the party that forms the government does not command a majority of England's MPs. And it may also be a government that depends upon, for instance, the support of the SNP or nationalist parties elsewhere. Now, in that situation, it seems to me EVIL is potentially quite incendiary.
I think Professor Wyn Jones wanted to come in.
Very briefly, Mike Kenny is the expert on this particular subject. All I would add is that whatever the rhetoric surrounding EVIL, the mechanism is designed as it's a blocking mechanism. There is no genuine effort to create a locus in which an English voice or English voices could emerge. And it's clear that if you look at well, if you look at the public attitudes around this, there is a sense that there's potential unfairness that needs to be stopped, but there's also a sense that England should have a voice, and evil doesn't give you that. And in terms of what we know about public attitudes towards the operation of evil, our best estimate is that only 2% of people in England know it's been introduced. Now, obviously, we might be out by a small margin, but if you're at 2%, then I think that tells you quite a lot. It's a highly technical process that only people like Mike Kenny can understand, frankly, and so it's not a great surprise that it's not made a big impression on the English public.
Yes, Professor Kenny.
Do you not think that part of that, though, comes from a change in the context? Because, you know, the genesis of it in many ways was the Blair government and the need for what was then, you know, over 40 Labour MPs from Scotland, which, you know, now seems a very long time ago, you know, essentially voting through very significant policy changes in England on tuition fees and foundation hospitals, and that, you know, therefore there was a context in which people viewed that debate, which currently isn't present.
I think that's absolutely the case. There was also the immediate context of the 2014 referendum and a sense amongst English Conservative MPs in particular that Gordon Brown had been allowed to give away the farm with the vow, and a sense that something needs to be done for England in the immediate aftermath of the referendum. I think you're right. You're right to say that there's a context. That the problem with a procedure which is simply a House of Commons procedural process is that it can be changed very quickly, and given that people don't even know that it exists, if an incoming regime which didn't have an English majority just got rid of it instantly, there might be a flutter, but this is not a process that has developed any legitimacy. There's no underpinning consensus. Coming back to the point we started our conversation with, there is no consensus around English governance that is cross-party, and that includes evil.
So I mean, and this is to each, to Professor Kenny and others if they want to, do you believe that the current evil arrangement then is a sustainable resolution of the so-called West Lothian question?
I mean, you know, to repeat, it has worked in the sense of it by providing this right of veto to English MPs. And without, it's complicated and it's a bit Byzantine, but it doesn't disrupt the business of the House in fundamental ways. It also doesn't. Some of the critics of evil were worried that it would fundamentally change the constitutional position of MPs from outside England, and there was this worry about two classes of MP being created. I mean, those worries don't seem to have been realised. So, in one sense,
but that's partly because many people don't realise that all MPs have the right to vote in a third reading.
Yeah, that's right.
So actually,
yeah,
the whole House ultimately has the veto, not English MPs.
Well, it's like a double veto, isn't it? It's the whole House as a veto, but English MPs could, if they were so minded, also exercise a veto over government legislation. It's just that they haven't been in a position to do that. I do think, just one point I would add though, is that I think, I mean, we produced a report on this very technical subject several years ago and made a number of proposals about how it might be simplified, whether it could be made more transparent, and so that the underpinning principle behind it, the sense of unfairness about those occasions when legislation is introduced that affects only England but relies on the support of MPs from other parts of the UK. That removing that anomaly, it seems as a point of principle, is important. It should be said as well, I think, that of course it's currently suspended, and that's because of the challenges, practical issues in relation to the current circumstances to do with COVID. I think it's interesting to reflect on how easily it has been suspended. It hasn't created any kind of debate as far as I can see. That, I think, perhaps creates an interesting precedent for a future administration that may, for other reasons, suggest that it ought to be suspended.
Thank you.
Next question is from Navendu Mishra.
Thank you, Chair. This is for Professor Wyn Jones. In 1997, Wales narrowly supported devolution. Support for devolution has subsequently increased, as have the powers of the Assembly, now Parliament. Why do you think support for devolution has grown in Wales, and does this provide an example of how devolution could be developed in England going forward?
Yeah, thank you. There's a great danger that I speak at length about this, having written about this at length. So I'll eschew that temptation. Wales is sometimes pointed to by supporters of English regional governance, and particularly in the North East, and saying, well, actually the majorities against devolution in 2004 in the North East of England was very similar to the majority against devolution in Wales in 1979, and therefore people can change their minds and so on and so forth. I think that the key difference is, I accept that, and I also accept the point that Michael Kenny was making earlier, is, in a sense, build it and they will come. And if you build something, it can develop legitimacy over time. The German Länder did that. People forget that the German Länder were actually quite unpopular when they were introduced, and they're now not. Clearly, there is now very strong majority support for the principle of Welsh devolution, which clearly wasn't the case in '97. The differences, however, I think are quite marked. I spoke earlier about the lack of consensus around even the boundaries that might define intermediate level governments in England. There is no consensus about that. Wales was an administrative unit for various purposes from the late 19th century on. There was a long period where people got used to, in education, public health, and so on and so forth. Then we had the establishment of the Wales Office in the mid-1960s. There was a long period where people got used to the idea of the Welsh-England border being an administrative boundary in important ways. We have nothing similar in terms of longevity in England. I mean, actually, London is probably the exception that proves the rule. In a sense, there was an idea of London-wide governments that Mrs. Thatcher, in her wisdom, decided to end. London governance is building on a tradition. You don't have that at the intermediate level in England. So there are some lessons that might be gleaned from Wales, but I think they're not the ones that people usually learn. I think it's about the importance of having some stability around administrative boundaries, some sense of we know what the unit that we're talking about is, and we don't have even that fundamental thing in England at the moment, and we're not going to get it without some different kind of a process than various elites just imposing their particular favourite solution for 10 years and then we move on.
Really interesting point you made about London government and how that was changed. Dr. Giovannini, did you want to come in briefly with, if I could have permission from the chair, just briefly?
Very quickly, I think Richard mentioned the case of Germany there while talking about making a comparison also with Wales. I think that we should ask ourselves, why has the support for London grown over time in Germany? This also leads to reflection on the question of scale as well. So Landers in Germany, when they were created, they were a mix of historical ones and completely artificial ones. So, and that mapped onto a system of local government that is empowered and not disempowered. But the mechanism of federalism that emerged in Germany is a cooperative one, where there is collaboration across and between all levels, and all levels are empowered. And I think that's what made a difference. That's why people bought into that system of decentralization, because being it based on artificial or historical units, over time people bought into it because there were real powers attached to it. And so people could see the difference that the system could make in their everyday life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
The next question is from Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you very much. Professor Kenny, should England use reserve power model like the rest of the UK? So, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, of course, have reserve power, but that's not how any of London or the metro mayors have developed. Is that a flaw?
I find it hard to see how a reserve powers model would work. Or at least if it were introduced, it's a very, very big step away, a set of steps away from where we are now. I think it's an interesting example of a wider tendency, which is to argue that because we've got asymmetry in our devolution arrangements, let's try and build something that's symmetrical. And sometimes people argue that therefore we should have an English parliament and that should be done on the reserve powers model. Or I think you're suggesting perhaps we would have large devolved entities within England which would have some sort of symmetrical
or small.
Yeah, or small. I think at the level of principle, I'm not convinced that symmetry is going to work in the UK. I just, there are, which is not to say that there are kinds of asymmetry that are problematic, but the drive to solve this through some sort of symmetrical solution, I think, is a misnomer. I don't think that will work.
So how should powers be agreed then? So if you're saying that doesn't really work, how would you get to a situation where powers are agreed rather than just handed down by these elites that we've heard a lot about in this discussion this morning?
I think the truth of it is that in a very centralised system, the only way to devolve is to get the centre to take the initiative. I think some version of handing down powers from the centre is inevitable. I think there are different ways to do that, and we talked about the sort of deal-making tight contractual model, which Sarah was discussing earlier, that's been used. That I think is different to a model which would look to create empowered devolved authorities, and which would accept that on certain key issues, those authorities have the right to disagree with what the centre wants to do. That seems to me to be the test of true devolution here, and it's not a test at the moment that is being met. So I'm sceptical about the reserve powers.
Professor Sarah Ayres, how should decisions, do you think, on English devolution be agreed? Do they need to be agreed with the people? Do we need kind of referendums to solidify these things and confirm them, or can we find another way of agreeing the distribution of power?
I think it comes back to the point that Professor Kenny's just made, which is about this two options, the technocratic or the something more fundamental where you hand power to the people. I think we've heard a bit of that through this evidence, so I won't labour the point, but it might be worth just saying that the academic literature doesn't identify a silver bullet or a magic formula globally. So what it does identify is that there's been a global trend towards decentralisation, but there has been huge differences across the globe about how they're making decisions about decentralisation, how they're going about regional or subnational forms of governance. I think in the UK, the next phase will be challenged to find what's appropriate to task in context, which is going to be very unique to the English experience. And it will be making this decision about whether it's technocratic or something more democratic. But either way, public expectations will need to be managed very carefully. If it is technocratic, we need to be clear about that. If it's something more fundamental, they're going to have to do it properly.
Professor Wyn Jones, I think you wanted to come in.
Just very briefly, I mean, technocratic is a dirty word in these kinds of conversations, and I want to put in a plea for technocratic solutions. If we think that there is a functional purpose to be served by an intermediate level of governance, I can't see, and we know what we know about public attitudes. You're not going to get that's not going to be driven by a big clamour in terms of public attitudes. There may well be an argument for the development of some kind of consensus at the elite level, and one of the problems is that we have particularly constant churn with very different visions of this. But actually, if we could get an agreement on boundaries, I could come back to the central importance of boundaries, because when those change all the time, which they do, it's very, very difficult to develop any kind of momentum in this space. So I think that a conversation between the political parties about the government and the governance of England is probably the most useful thing that could happen. It also may well be the most difficult thing to ask for. Academics can pose these questions and don't necessarily have to answer them. But I think that if this is a functional, focused level of government, then I think that a conversation between elites and not overselling, not over-promoting what we're trying to do here is the way forward. So something modest and technocratic may well be the way forward.
Dr. Giovannini.
Just before we go on to Dr. Giovannini, I just wanted to ask Professor Jones, you mentioned about technocratic, and you say London maybe is the exception that proves the rule. When Thatcher got rid of London governance, what continued was particularly the Metropolitan Police, but also some sort of transport so there was a continued identity that people related to. You've not mentioned, no one's mentioned particularly so far, police boundaries, which have been relatively stable in England. They're based generally on historic counties, and would they provide an element of people being able to say this is the continued administrative boundary that has lasted for many, many years? And there's a general kind of political consensus around where those boundaries are, barring a few discussions around mergers here or there.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an interesting case, but it also speaks to what I'm trying to say. So the efforts to democratise the police commissioners, I think that you'd have to be hugely optimistic to say that that's been a big democratic triumph. So overselling this hasn't done these things any favours, I would argue. But I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pontificate about boundaries. But your point is a very valid one about boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, the police commissioners did provide a mapping on of a lot of the metro mayor areas. So to some extent, whilst them themselves haven't really worked, they have provided a launch for some of the metro mayor devolution deals that have mapped on to them. Look, I want to go to Dr. Giovannini. What aims and principles do you think should underpin devolution in England? So we've had lots of discussions, technocratic, cultural, city regions, etc. Are there some common principles? Do we just end up taking a mismatched approach in different areas of England depending on where you are?
I think it's very important to have a clear set of principles going forward. So going forward, really, devolution should be developed within a fair decision-making process so that decisions on the future of subnational governance in England are not taken unilaterally by the centre and imposed on locality. And that's perhaps something in between what was said before, that super technocratic approach and the radical one that brings in the people. We do have local government in England. They are directly elected and representative. So why don't we bring them into the debate on what devolution should look like going forward? So I think the first step in this direction would be that of setting out a comprehensive devolution framework. And the aim of devolution, this should really clearly outline the aim of devolution by setting a long-term vision, which is currently missing and has been missing for a long time, of what devolution is about. So devolution should holds a huge potential, not only to address persisting regional inequalities, but as it has clearly emerged from the discussion today, there is also a democratic element to it. So it's really important that a devolution framework should set clear principles that guide the process, avoiding the imposition of fixed rules from the centre, which again is what we have been seeing so far. Think about the imposition of metro mayors, even on areas that didn't really want them. I'm not saying metro mayors are necessarily bad, but that doesn't allow any flexibility. And in terms of principle, the clear starting point there would that of embracing the principle of subsidiarity, the principle that decisions should always be taken at the lowest level or closest level to where they will have their effect. For example, at the local level or city region or regional level, rather than by the center for the whole country. So this should really be the building block in terms of principle of devolution. And it's quite an obvious point, but so far there has been a lot of rhetoric of subsidiarity, but very little subsidiarity in practice in the process of devolution. Then this principle of subsidiarity should be matched with also principles of collaboration, diffuse leadership, accountability, and trust. All things that at the moment are missing in the process. And so establishing these core principles and putting them at the heart of the devolution agenda would really help ensure that a new devolution framework would not be set by default from the center and at its own terms and conditions. So the new framework should really be developed in close consultation with local authorities, for example, through the creation of some form of state subnational government committee that would oversee the development of the devolution framework. We have to keep in mind that this is the norm in many other countries. There needs to be a point of contact, an official point of contact where different levels of government can come together and have a discussion about the future of subnational government in England. So in this way, the framework really would aim to create a functioning system of multi-level governance, including local, regional, and national tiers, and then be able to present a series of flexible, yet clear and transparent options for power and funding arrangement that should be made available not just to a few areas, but to all parts of the countries. So there is a need there to have a degree of flexibility as well, because it has, as it has been mentioned before, different areas in England have different levels of institutional capacity. Greater Manchester worked straight away, was able to take on board a lot of power from day one, because it had a long history of cooperation between the local authorities there. Other areas might not be in that position. So there should be a clear understanding of what are the powers and resources available to all areas, but then areas should be able to come in the process of devolution when they are ready for it, when they have built that capacity to come in. And I think that this would allow really to move on from the current system, which is based on ad hocery. I don't think the current system is asymmetric. There is ad hocery in the current system, and there is a substantial difference there, because asymmetry means that you really tailor the process of devolution around the needs of different areas, whether an ad hoc system is driven by the center and tends to be place blind, which is a big problem at the moment. So the strong foundation for devolution going forward would be to base it on principles of subsidiarity, collaboration, diffuse leadership, flexibility, and trust. And in this way, you would do two things at the same time. You would set devolution on the right path, and you would also help to take a first step in the right direction in reforming center-local relations in England, because that is the big underlying problem there.
I just wonder quickly, in the sense of the Metro Mayor devolution deals in Manchester and others, the chamber, as it were, the legislative chamber, as it were, in those bodies, is made up of the leaders of the subunits within it, and so you have a bond really. It's within the governance. Are you saying that actually that needs to then have at the next level up? There needs to be that kind of bond where the Metro Mayors or whatever that kind of leadership is at that regional layer has a formal kind of bond international government, whether it's kind of the German model or whether it's kind of some other kind of arrangement where they get together, the Australian model where you get the premiers together to agree joint strategies.
Yes,
is that what you're kind of summarizing?
I think that is one big missing link at the moment. There is no official forum for the different levels of subnational government to come in and make decisions together. At the moment, if we look at how devolution deals have evolved so far, is the center that sets the rules and then asks local government to come in with a proposal and bid for devolution. That's not the same thing as agreeing together the principles that should guide devolution. And it makes a substantial difference because it creates competition, as I said before, but it also doesn't create a cooperative or collaborative kind of relationship between center, city, regional, and local government. And that is, as we have seen, I think, very clearly in the past few months, that can create a lot of problems. So having a meeting point where there can be constructive debate and decision can be made together, it would be very important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And John Stevenson wants to come in with a supplementary question here.
Thank you, Chair. There's been a lot of talk about lack of vision, and there's a lot of talk about boundaries and structures. And from my perspective, I would have thought that actually one of the most fundamental aspects of the whole devolution debate is actually creating the structure in which you would then build the devolutionary settlements. And if I can take you back to the 1960s and the Maud report, which was based on sort of 60-odd authorities based around major towns, commercial and social centres and travel patterns, would you agree that that actually may be a good basis for this whole debate, that we should actually go back to the sort of principles of the Maud report? And Professor Ayres, you started with the lack of vision that we have today. Do you think they actually had a bit of vision back in the 60s?
Quite possibly. I'm not familiar with that piece of report, although emphasis on functional economic areas, travel to work areas has been part of this developing incremental approach to English regionalism. So from 2010, when Eric Pickles got rid of the regional tier, there was this emphasis on functional economic geographies looking slightly different in different parts of England. So that kind of narrative has fed into leading to where we are now. I don't know if other colleagues might have a further view on that.
Professor Wyn Jones, you mentioned boundaries. Do you see merit in creating those sort of structures, or building on what we've got today rather than looking back to the past for a potential solution?
My suspicion would be that there's a great danger that if you're going to throw everything up in the air and start again, nothing will happen. So one is tempted to say, yes, there was this great report, and it's a great shame that it wasn't implemented 50 years ago, but it wasn't, and we are where we are. And my overriding sense, having spent the last several months looking at English governance, is just this churn, this constant churn. And I think that's just utterly debilitating. So unless you get an improbable level of buy-in to returning to Maud, I suspect that if I were to say, yeah, let's do that, then I'm just suggesting more churn that will be replaced by something else within 10 years. So I think that despite the temptation to say, yes, they got that seemed sensible, I'm afraid that we have to start where we are.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question from Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. It's a wrap-up all. The current COVID pandemic has brought attention to the relative powers of local authorities and devolved governments. So what impact do you think COVID could have on English devolution? To anyone.
Will I have a first stab at that? I mean, it's possible that this could be a very significant moment. We don't yet know, obviously, because we don't know how this is going to play out. I suppose two areas where there's been, I think, a real shining of a light, a harsh light, upon some of these relationships. One is in terms of the manner in which central government has responded to the crisis. I mean, in a number of different areas, be it from its initial approach to establishing a contact tracing system, the lack of willingness to engage with health officials, with medical directors in different parts of the country. It appears that COVID has produced a kind of very centralising reflex in the current government at the moment, and I don't think it's just about this administration. I think this does tell us something about the structures of government as we've been discussing here. And it also appears that some other systems that have a more multiple layered model, which have the kind of partnership working we've been talking about, and where the centre appears to accept and trust the locality to get on with things like testing and so on, particularly Germany, it does appear that the outcomes are better. Now, I think it's going to take us some while before we can be certain about that. But I think that's a very salutary lesson potentially for our system. The second area is in terms of the very contemporary conflicts going on about regional lockdowns. And I think one of the things we're learning there is that some of the metro mayors are, whilst we've talked about the limitations of their powers and the constraints under which they work, but they have some political power and voice and a mandate. And also, it's interesting to see them starting to work together in some ways as well. And it could well be that this inaugurates a new phase in the political role and visibility and profile of those figures. But I really think we can't be certain about that at this point.
Dr. Giovannini.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with Mike that there are signs that this might be a significant moment. I think throughout the pandemic, people have been learning and are still learning the hard way what's the problem with over-centralization in England. And I think that we are also seeing that devolution is a process and not an event, to quote the former Minister of State for Wales. And so when it is set in motion, it is very difficult to control it from the center, no matter how hard the government actually might want to. So what is happening recently with the mayors is really an explanation of the fact that if devolution is set to work on a way that is competitive and where there is no clear point of contact and a discussion between different levels of government, it may become problematic and it may create frictions. So if we are to build back better going forward, this really requires a profound rethinking of how central-local relations work in England. And I think that the white paper on devolution that is due to come out next year could provide a great opportunity really to rethink this and make sure that at least there are some clear principles in place that allow to improve the process of devolution and the quality and level of central-local relations in England.
Yes, Professor Ayres.
Just one sentence. The challenges that we will face post-COVID are going to be so complicated, so multi-dimensional, so great, that it's going to require this collaborative, joined-up approach, which is very difficult to manage and implement from the top. So one argument is that you can only solve these really complex challenges at a local level, and it could be seen as an opportunity for cities and devolved structures to take that on board.
Thank you. And that's the end of our questions. So could I thank all our witnesses today for contributing to what I think was a very lively and interesting discussion and an excellent start to our inquiry. I'd like to thank my colleagues too from all over the country and here in Westminster for attending, and to the staff of the committee, and also to the broadcasting staff who ensured that we had, I think, a perfect session today in terms of technology. So once again, can I thank you all for your contributions. Order, order.